Chapter 8. The Blonde, the Boss, the Archetype. In the hours after the Coldplay Jumbotron clip went viral, before Kristen Cabot had spoken a single word publicly, before any interview or statement or narrative had been offered, a certain kind of content began to circulate alongside the clip itself. Articles, posts, comment threads, and what can only be described as forensic inventories of her physical appearance. Her height, her weight, her hair color, described with the specific appreciative vocabulary usually reserved for real estate listings or fashion catalogs. One widely circulated piece documented her measurements with the precision and tone of a casting brief, describing her as the definition of tall, blonde, and breathtaking, and enumerating her physical attributes with a detail that would not have been applied to Andy Byron under any circumstances. This is where this chapter begins, not with an abstract discussion of archetypes and bias, but with what actually happened to Kristen Cabot's body in public discourse before she had done anything other than appear on a screen. Because what happened to her body in public discourse is both a genuine injustice that this book takes seriously and a data point in a larger argument about how appearance functions in stories like this one, how it shapes the narrative before the narrative has been built, and how the shape it gives to the narrative is not always the shape that serves truth. The image before the individual. Before she spoke, before she explained, before any version of what actually happened had been offered, there was an image, a woman, blonde, visibly composed, confident in the ease of someone accustomed to occupying professional spaces at a senior level. That image did not arrive in the public consciousness empty. It arrived carrying the accumulated weight of a cultural archive that has been filling itself for decades with associations, assumptions, and narrative templates attached to a particular kind of feminine presentation. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a deliberate process. It is how archetypes function. They operate below the level of conscious reasoning, shaping perception before perception has had time to evaluate individual facts. The psychologist Carl Jung described archetypes as primordial images, inherited patterns of thought and association that structure human experience. They are not invented fresh in each encounter. They arrive with the encounter, preloaded, and they shape what we see before we have decided what we are looking at. The archetype that Cabot's image activated is one of the most durable in Western culture. The attractive, professionally positioned woman whose relationship with a powerful man is presumed, instinctively and without evidence, to have been transactional. This archetype has a long history and many names. It has appeared in literature, in film, in workplace gossip, and in the specific cultural vocabulary of contempt that the comment sections deployed within hours of the clip going viral: homewrecker, gold digger, side piece. Each of these terms is not simply a description of an action. It is an activation of an archetype. It says, we know what kind of woman this is because we have seen this kind of woman before. The specific problem with archetypes is that they make individual facts feel redundant. Once the template has been applied, the details of the actual situation are filtered through it rather than examined on their own terms. This produces two kinds of error simultaneously. It over-attributes to the individual what belongs to the type, and it under-examines what is actually there because the type already seems to explain it. Cabot was not seen, in the first days after the clip went viral, as a specific person in a specific situation with specific context that would eventually complicate the initial reading. She was seen as the archetype, and the archetype required no further investigation. The forensic dismantling of a body. Let us be specific about what the appearance scrutiny actually looked like because the specificity matters. Cabot told the New York Times in December 2025 that she was picked apart for every aspect of her appearance and life. Her hairstylist was attacked online, a detail that is not a small one because it describes the specific radius of the hostility, not just the person, but the people adjacent to her, the people associated with her appearance, the people whose professional connection to how she looks was treated as a point of access for cruelty. The comment threads anatomized her hair, her clothing, her age, her body. One widely shared article, intended apparently as a kind of profile, documented her physical measurements with an enthusiasm that had no equivalent in the coverage of Andy Byron. Byron, who was also in the frame, also ducked, and whose choices in the months and years preceding the concert were, by any reasonable analysis, at least as significant as Cabot's, was not subjected to this. His appearance was not inventoried. His body was not measured and evaluated in public discourse. The terms applied to him, CEO, boss, astronomer executive, were professional. The terms applied to her, even by outlets that were nominally attempting journalism rather than commentary, frequently circled back to her physical presentation. Because the archetype that applied to Byron was the archetype of the powerful man, which does not require a physical accounting. And the archetype applied to Cabot required exactly that. This asymmetry is not trivial. It is one of the most consistent findings in research on gendered media treatment. Women in public controversies are evaluated through their physical presentation to a degree and with a specificity that has no male equivalent. A 2020 study published in Political Research Quarterly found that female politicians were described in terms of their appearance significantly more often than male politicians, even when the coverage was ostensibly about policy. Research on workplace discrimination consistently documents that attractive women are perceived, paradoxically, as both advantaged and as less professionally credible, a double bind in which their appearance is both an asset attributed to them and a liability used against them. Cabot's experience after the clip went viral was a concentrated, accelerated version of a dynamic that women navigate at lower volume in ordinary professional life every day. The hairstylist who was attacked online did not choose to be in this story. The person who invented the forensic inventory of Cabot's measurements did not know Kristen Cabot. They knew the archetype. And the archetype, once activated, has a momentum that individual facts do not easily interrupt. The author's reflection. This chapter requires a moment of personal clarity before it continues. I do not respond to Kristen Cabot's appearance. What she looks like is not the source of my reaction to this story, and the chapter that follows this one is not powered by anything she represents physically or symbolically in the categories that the cultural archetype would suggest. I am not responding to her as a type. I am responding to a situation, to choices made, to impacts that followed, to a narrative constructed around those impacts that has been examined in careful detail throughout this book. I say this not to perform virtue, but because the chapter makes an argument that requires it. The argument is that the appearance-based response to Cabot was a genuine injustice, that it deployed an archetype in ways that were unfair to her as an individual, and that distorted the conversation about what actually happened. Making that argument requires being clear that my own analysis is not derived from the same source. The harshness of the appearance scrutiny and the gendered double standard it reflects is real, and it is wrong, and it can be named as wrong without that naming serving as a defense of everything else. Both things can be true. Bias can be real, and accountability can still be required. This chapter holds both. What the archetype obscured. The activation of the archetype did something specific to the public conversation about this story. It shifted the question from what happened to who she is. And those are very different questions with very different implications. The question of what happened requires examining choices, context, impact, and responsibility. It requires the kind of careful, evidence-based analysis that this book has been attempting throughout. It is uncomfortable because it distributes accountability across multiple people and requires holding complexity. It does not resolve cleanly into a single villain or a single victim. The question of who she is, or rather who the archetype says she is, requires none of that. The archetype already knows the answer. The attractive professional woman with a powerful boss is a specific cultural figure with a specific presumed motivation, and once that figure has been activated, the conversation about motivation is over before it starts. She did what she did because that is what women like her do. The archetype provides the explanation. The individual becomes unnecessary. This foreclosure of the individual is what made the forensic inventory of Cabot's appearance so damaging, not only to her, but to any genuine understanding of the situation. Because once the archetype has explained her, there is no reason to examine anything else. The professional dynamic, a CEO and his chief people officer, the specific power arrangement and its implications, becomes just the setting for the archetype's story rather than a thing to be examined in its own right. The choices, Byron's, Cabot's, the choices that preceded the concert by months become the archetype's behavior rather than specific decisions made by specific people with specific responsibilities. The archetype simplified a complicated situation into a legible story. And the legible story was wrong in specific ways that mattered, not because Cabot was without responsibility, but because the archetype's version of her responsibility was not the whole picture and required no engagement with the whole picture to feel satisfying. When 90% come from women. One of the most striking statistics Cabot offered across both interviews was this. She was told that 90% of the online comments and hate came from women, and that all of the in-person confrontations, including the woman who accosted her at a petrol station and told her she did not deserve to breathe the same air, were women. This figure, if accurate, requires examination rather than either celebration or dismissal. Chapter 7 of this book examined the women's response in careful detail. The recognition, the pattern matching, the genuine knowledge that drove much of it, and argued that the substance of that response was more legitimate than the form it took. But the appearance-based dimension of the response is the form this chapter is most directly concerned with. And the appearance-based dimension was not primarily about recognition. It was not the response of women who had been in Megan Kerrigan Byron's position and recognized the dynamic. It was something more specifically gendered and more specifically troubling. There is a phenomenon that social psychologists have documented under various names: lateral violence, horizontal hostility, internalized misogyny, that describes the specific pattern in which women direct at other women the harshest versions of the judgments that the broader culture makes about female behavior. It is not a simple phenomenon, and explaining it requires care. Women who participate in the forensic criticism of other women's appearances are not simply internalizing sexism mechanically. They are operating in a cultural environment in which women's appearance is treated as a legitimate site of evaluation, and they have absorbed that evaluation framework through years of exposure to it. When a particular type of woman, the attractive, powerful, apparently transgressive woman, activates cultural anxiety, the appearance-based criticism is one of the most available forms that criticism can take. This does not make it less damaging. The woman who had her hairstylist attacked online did not deserve that. The inventories of her physical measurements were unjust, regardless of who wrote them. The terms homewrecker, gold digger carry a weight of gender judgment that attaches to women and not to men in equivalent situations, and that weight is real even when it is deployed by women rather than men. But Cabot's analysis of this, that women holding each other back is the explanation for what she experienced, does not account for the full picture. The 90% who came from women were not only expressing internalized misogyny. Many of them were, as Chapter 7 argued, expressing pattern recognition. They were women who had been in Megan Kerrigan Byron's position, or who had feared it, and whose response mixed legitimate recognition with the appearance-based judgment that the cultural framework makes available. The appearance scrutiny and the recognition were not the same thing. Collapsing them into a single explanation, women holding women back, obscures the part of the response that was not bias, and in doing so, avoids engaging with it. The professional layer. There is another dimension to how Cabot's appearance functioned in public discourse, and it is one that intersects with her professional role in ways that require careful examination. Cabot was not simply a woman at a concert. She was a chief people officer, the head of human resources at a billion-dollar company, the person professionally responsible for the management of exactly the kind of workplace dynamic that her relationship with Byron represented. Her professional role carried specific obligations that existed independently of her personal situation. She was the person whose job it was to be aware of and flag situations where reporting relationships created risks. She knew this. She said so explicitly in the Oprah interview, acknowledging that her role required her to recognize when something might cause a problem from a work standpoint. The intersection of her appearance and her professional role produced a specific additional layer in the public response. The assumption that her position had been obtained through the relationship rather than through professional competence. This assumption was stated explicitly in multiple comment threads and implicitly in the framing of several news articles. LinkedIn posts praising her work by Byron were cited as evidence of favoritism. The specific prejudice applied here, that attractive women in senior positions are presumed to have arrived there through relationships rather than merit, is one of the most extensively documented forms of gender bias in professional contexts. Research published in the Journal of Applied Psychology has found that physically attractive women in professional settings are more likely than their less attractive counterparts to be perceived as having obtained their positions through illegitimate means, particularly when those positions involve proximity to powerful men. This is not a minor finding. It describes a specific measurable bias that operates against attractive women in professional life. A bias that makes their competence less legible and their relationships with male superiors more suspect. It is a bias that applied to Cabot in concentrated form in the weeks after the clip went viral. And it is a bias that existed alongside a legitimate question about the professional dimension of the situation. The question of what it means for a chief people officer to develop a relationship with her CEO, and what the implications of that relationship were for the organization she was professionally responsible for protecting. Those two things, the bias and the legitimate question, arrived together in public discourse and were never successfully separated. The bias distorted the legitimate question by attaching it to assumptions about how she obtained her position. The legitimate question was used to give the bias the appearance of professional seriousness. Both operated simultaneously, to the detriment of any clear-eyed examination of what had actually happened. Power and proximity. The professional dimension of this story, the CEO and his chief people officer, the reporting relationship, the specific power arrangement, has been examined in various forms throughout this book. But in the context of a chapter about archetypes and appearance, it deserves a specific note. The power dynamic was rendered nearly invisible by the activation of the archetype, and that invisibility served a specific purpose. In most contexts where a power differential between a senior and a subordinate is acknowledged, the moral weight of the situation is assigned disproportionately to the person with greater power. The person with less power is presumed to be operating under the influence of the arrangement in ways that complicate a straightforward assessment of their choices. This framework is applied with some consistency in sexual harassment cases, in mentoring relationships, in teacher-student dynamics. The logic is simple. Power changes the nature of decisions made within its orbit, and that change is relevant to how responsibility is assessed. In the Coldplay story, this framework was not consistently applied. The CEO who developed a romantic attachment to his direct report, who by Cabot's account also misrepresented the status of his marriage to her, was not typically discussed in terms of his power over her professional situation. He was discussed primarily as the other person in the frame, and then he resigned and disappeared, and the power dynamic largely disappeared with him. Cabot, who had less institutional power than Byron, became the primary object of the response, including the appearance-based response, while Byron, who had more, was allowed to be absent from it. The archetype explains this. The archetype of the attractive, powerful adjacent woman does not include vulnerability to the power of the man beside her. It presumes agency, calculation, intention. It does not make room for the possibility that the person whose appearance activates the archetype might also be operating within a power structure that complicates the simplicity of the story the archetype tells. The archetype flattens the power dynamic by making the woman's appearance the explanation for everything that followed. And when appearance is the explanation, power becomes irrelevant. The danger of overcorrection. Having examined the bias carefully and at length, this chapter must now name the risk that attaches to that examination, the risk of overcorrection. Overcorrection is what happens when the identification of bias becomes in itself a form of protection from accountability. When the argument that someone was judged unfairly, which may be entirely true, is extended to mean that they should not be judged at all. When the legitimate critique of how a person was discussed becomes a reason to stop discussing what they actually did. When the archetype's distortion of the situation is used to make the situation itself undiscussable. This move is recognizable and it is common, and it has appeared in the public conversation about this story in specific forms. The appearance scrutiny was unjust, therefore the scrutiny itself was unjust. The death threats were wrong, therefore the criticism was wrong. The double standard in how Cabot and Byron were treated is real. Therefore, Cabot should be exempt from the accountability that was applied to them unequally. Each of these moves takes something true and extends it in a direction that produces a false conclusion. The appearance scrutiny was unjust. It was also not the only scrutiny. The fact that some of the criticism was delivered through a biased lens does not mean that the subject of the criticism was without anything to account for. The injustice of how the conversation was conducted does not erase the substance of what needed to be in the conversation. And a defense of Cabot that works primarily by pointing to how she was discussed, rather than engaging with what she did and what it meant for the people most affected by it, is a defense that protects the narrative rather than serving the truth. This book has not made that move. It has named the bias consistently and specifically. It has defended Cabot against the forms of criticism that were unjust. It has argued repeatedly and with force that Andy Byron's treatment, his ability to disappear while she bore the full weight of the public aftermath, reflected a gendered double standard that is real and important. All of that stands, and the accountability question also stands. The appearance scrutiny was wrong. The actions that preceded the concert were still consequential. Both things remain true. And the archetype, for all the damage it did to the conversation, did not change that. Beyond the archetype. What would it mean to see Kristen Cabot beyond the archetype? Not to excuse her, and not to condemn her through a lens that does not apply consistently, but to see her clearly, as a specific person, in a specific situation, with specific choices behind her and specific consequences ahead of her. It would mean acknowledging that she is a 53-year-old woman with a career of more than 2 decades in human resources, a woman who built teams and cultures, and who was, before July 16, 2025, not a public figure in any meaningful sense. A woman who made choices that had consequences for people she cared about and for people she had never met. A woman who was then subjected to a form of public response that was disproportionate in its cruelty and gendered in its specific mechanisms, and who navigated that response, imperfectly, strategically, with the help of a communications consultant, in ways this book has examined carefully. While the man who stood beside her in the frame moved in silence through an aftermath that was structurally easier for him to navigate. Seeing her clearly means refusing the archetype simplification in both directions, the archetype that made her the villain of a story about female transgression, and the counter-narrative that has made her the hero of a story about female victimhood. Neither of those stories accounts for Megan Kerrigan Byron, who is the person who most deserves to be at the center of any honest account of what happened and what it cost. The archetype is not the truth. It is a shortcut that the truth does not need, because the truth, in all its complexity, its distributed responsibility, its gendered double standards, and its genuine moral weight, is more interesting and more important than any archetype could contain. The blonde, the boss, the archetype. None of them are Kristen Cabot, and none of them are the story. The story is what was broken, what it cost, who it cost most, and whether in the end the account of it that has been offered publicly is honest enough to serve the people for whom honesty is the only thing that could.